At first glance, Barbarian can seem like just another one of those movies. You know the kind. Horror movies that were intentionally made on a shoestring budget to try and get some type of return on investment. The plot is thin, the characters are poorly written, and the scares are cheap. Well, then again, that's most Hollywood movies these days, but I digress. On a friend's request, despite knowing nothing about the film, I decided to venture into it and see if I could come out the other side without mourning the loss of an hour and a half of my life. And after my journey, I can safely say that I actually enjoyed every minute of it. Welcome to Film Review. Now let's talk about Barbarian. Barbarian is a horror movie that released in September of 2022 and was directed by Zach Cregger. So the premise of this movie is pretty simple. The main character, Tess, arrives on a rainy night to a home in Detroit, Michigan that she's renting while she's in town interviewing for a job. The only problem is, someone's already there. Tess confronts this person only to find out that there must have been a mistake because he too had rented the home. After some back and forth, the man invites Tess inside the home. Tess is hesitant, but eventually steps inside, and unbeknownst to her, begins a brutal and horrifying chain of events. Barbarian is a smart, stylish, and surprisingly funny film that really took me by surprise. Like I said before, I wasn't expecting a whole lot going in, but as the movie continued, I found myself absorbed into the story, and the immersion was amplified by the terrific cast of actors. I've never seen Georgina Campbell in a movie before, but I thought she was stellar. She comes across as just a normal young woman who's being cautious in an awkward situation where she's in the same house at night with a complete stranger. She's a likable and compassionate person, which makes you root for her throughout the movie. Bill Skarsgård also knocks it out of the park as Keith, who is the stranger inside of the house. I absolutely loved his performance in 2017's It, where he portrayed Pennywise the Clown, but Keith is a much more toned down and nuanced character, and I thought Skarsgård handled it masterfully. Justin Long plays the character AJ, who's an up-and-coming actor from a TV show, and, well, to be honest, he's a complete jerk. Justin Long's performance was probably my favorite in the entire movie, as he perfectly embodied a selfish, egotistical moron who will do just about anything to avoid any kind of responsibility. I've been watching Justin Long in horror movies ever since Jeepers Creepers back in 2001, and it was a joy to watch him do his thing. So as far as the technical aspects of Barbarian go, I didn't really have any issues. In fact, I thought they were very well done. Everything from the camera work to the music to the visual effects was brilliant. But there was one story decision that I thought was a bit strange, and I'll keep it mostly spoiler-free in case you haven't seen it. At about the 30-minute mark, the film reaches a huge moment, and then abruptly cuts to a completely different storyline. Now, the storyline that it cuts to eventually does tie into the events from the beginning in a pretty neat way. It just takes a while to get there. I don't necessarily see this as a negative, though. It's more of a creative decision based on the kind of story they wanted to tell, and I applaud them for taking a narrative risk instead of playing it safe. Now, I'm not a huge fan of slasher movies like Friday the 13th or horror movies that are overtly graphic just for the sake of it. I've always preferred the slower-paced, quote-unquote, slow-burn horror like The Shining or Hereditary that rely on atmosphere and unsettling imagery rather than gore. And although I wouldn't put Barbarian on par with those films, it shares some qualities in that it's not one that shows intense violence very often, which I appreciated. The focus is on the characters and the ever-increasing tension that's building because of their circumstances and the choices that they make. It has a couple scenes that are fairly graphic, but that's not the point of the story. Barbarian has a subtext that starts off fairly subtle in the beginning, but towards the end becomes much more apparent. It mainly has to do with the character of AJ and a choice he made that he can't seem to accept responsibility for. He's continually rationalizing and making excuses, but lacks the humility to accept that maybe he was in the wrong. But there's also the theme of how we as people decide to trust or to not trust people, and how different situations and societal influences can shape that decision. It's a film that definitely has some things to say, and they may not be all things that I believe, but for me it didn't interfere with the narrative or take me out of the movie. I know I'm keeping it pretty vague here, but I really don't want to spoil anything, because the less you know about this movie going in, I think the better experience you'll have. What surprised me about Barbarian was the fact that it never took itself too seriously. There are actually some really funny moments that caught me off guard and had me laughing out loud. I'm usually not a fan of combining comedy into dark horror, but they pulled it off perfectly here. I also just had such a fun time watching this movie. At times, I really had no idea where the story was going, which made it feel like I was going on a journey with these characters. It reminded me of horror movies that were made in the 80s and 90s. They were fun because they took you on a roller coaster ride of an adventure, and by the time you got off, you had your hands in the air and were yelling again, again. Barbarian is that rare kind of horror movie that only comes around maybe once or twice a year. It's smart, it's creative, it's full of twists and turns, and ultimately it was a blast to watch. So if you haven't seen it, buckle up and get ready for a wild ride. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more like it, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you later.